Well, good afternoon. My name is Gary Allison. I am the director of the University of Tulsa College of Law's Sustainable Energy and Resources Law Program. It is my pleasure today to make a presentation that is sort of a shakedown of one I will in part make in Moscow next Friday. Dean Levitt and I are going to partake in some of the activities in association with Moscow Energy Week, and I only get 20 minutes to speak there, so I'm not going to give them the whole version I'm giving you today. I've got a lot of material to present. I may go through a little rapidly, but I do hope I can get through everything. I have put together some slides I think are very important to your understanding of how our electric grid works and where we're heading, where we've been and where we're heading. So the goals of my presentation today are to define and discuss the characteristics of an electric power grid, provide information about the United States current power grid, describe the evolution from natural monopoly regulation to regulated competition, and to raise but not answer some important questions about our electric power future. And let me say that if you've dealt with electric power regulation at all, you know that I am abbreviating some thousands and thousands of pages of regulatory preambles and studies. So I'm doing my best to let you see the forest and not get caught up in tall weeds. All right, so this is a pretty good image of an abbreviated image of what a power grid looks like. We have a generator, and the electric power that's generated moves along high voltage transmission lines. They reach a substation. At the point it reaches the substation, we're beginning to enter into the distribution process of electric power. We have some main distribution lines that take the electricity toward where the ultimate end users are. Then we have the local distribution lines. Some are underground, some are overhead. These are the main, and then here's local, and then here are the service lines coming off to the individual users. Those of you who consume electricity are in the vernacular of the regulated world called load, so don't be offended by that. All right, so generation is where the electric power plants spin a turbine that causes generators to generate the electric energy. The transmission lines connect generators to distribution systems and other power systems, and the electric energy is conducted at very high voltage, and this is to ensure that the power can move over significant distances. A transmission system or network is configured in a way where there may be multiple paths that lead to between points or nodes on the network. The distribution system delivers electricity from the transmission system to the load, and it consists of the substations that are used to step down the voltage coming off of the transmission lines and before they enter the local distribution lines, and there's some other step downs as they enter into the service lines. The local distribution lines are primary feeders, take the power from the initial substations and deliver it to the next set of transformers to step down the power before it enters service lines. And then the service lines deliver power to the load or the customers. Now here's the really important part that for a long time was not recognized in U.S. regulatory law. The electric power grid operates in electromagnetic unity. Generators propagate an electromagnetic wave. This is the electric energy. And each electron is induced to repel the electron in the next atom. But these electrons aren't what's moving. That charge isn't moving through electrons, moving through the wire. What it establishes is this electromagnetic wave, the electric energy, and that's what moves. The electrons oscillate back and forth in unison, and this is how we get an alternating current that we use here in the United States. In the United States, the current, or this alternating current, reverses itself 60 times a second. All electricity within the grid must be on the same frequency, this 60 megahertz frequency. And all power generators must be synchronized and operated in parallel. If not, you're going to have a fritz on the system. Electric energy moves through the grid at the speed of light. It's 182,282 miles a second, and along the paths of the least resistance or impedance. So as they move through the transmission lines, as they're hitting areas of the transmission system where the capacity of those lines have filled up, then they encounter impedance along the way as they go, but they can hit significant impedance as the lines reach their capacity. Within a transmission network of multiple paths between points and nodes, the electric energy moves along each in the inverse proportion to the impedance of this path. So what this means is that the path of electric energy can't be directed. You have no idea where it's going to go when it comes out of the plant. If there are forks in the road, it'll take them every time, every part of the fork, as long as there's not significant impedance to create a constraint. Consumers then take undifferentiated energy from the grid. Now what's important about that is that if you have, and I'm going to show a bigger grid in a moment, but if you have a huge grid and you're way down here, you may have contracted with somebody up here to generate your electricity. You don't have some direct line coming from here to here. That energy is flowing throughout the network. The grid must be in balance. The sum of the currents flowing into the system must equal the current flowing out of the system, or blackouts can occur. So at all times you've got energy coming in and you've got the load taking energy out, and it has to stay balanced or you have very difficult problems. Essentially, when generation starts on an interconnected network, the whole grid is energized, and you can put electricity in here and take it out of a whole lot of different points. That's what we mean by the load or the consumer can take undifferentiated energy. You have no idea whether the energy that you contracted for, whether that power plant actually delivered something or not. It's the grid that's filling up. Okay, so I said that you've got to keep things in balance, and there are rules about how you keep things in balance and how you keep your equipment up so you don't have transmission interruptions. And we have delegated to the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, the responsibility of establishing and enforcing reliability standards for U.S. bulk power systems. Now, in the United States, we've got what we call 3 major interconnections. And what this means is that the transmission networks in this part of the country, the Western interconnection, they've got ties together. So this is, for all practical purposes, an intertied grid. Then we have the Eastern connection, and Texas, always wanting to be by itself, has its own. They never want to cooperate. So these little sub-territories are the reliability regions that FERC has used to, the regional entities, that NERC uses to monitor things at the local level. So we have 4 transmission interconnections in North America, and in the aggregate they have greater than 445,000 miles of transmission lines greater than 100 kilovolts. 100 kilovolts, when you get above that, that's when you begin to talk about that you're in a transmission or a bulk delivery system. Below that, now we're talking about a distribution system. The Eastern interconnect is most of the U.S. and Canada east of the Rockies. It has 273,000 miles of network. The Western is U.S. and Canada west of the Rockies. It has 120,000 miles. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, is most of Texas. It's 29,000 miles. And then Quebec in northeastern Canada, that's another group that likes to be by itself, is about 23,000. Unlike other forms of energy, electric energy cannot be stored. You can store any other kind of stuff. And what this means is as soon as you've got that electric energy produced, you've got to consume it immediately. That's what it means to have in balance. We do not have the technology to have that energy go somewhere and be banked away in order to, and then draw it out again. Demand for electric energy fluctuates significantly over the day, week, month, and annually. So the amount of generation capacity needed must be sufficient to meet peak demands. That means that, and I'm going to show you a load curve here in a minute, but that means you're sizing your entire generating capacity to the peaks of the system, not what you need to run during the times of level demand on the system. So during off-peak, some generators are idled. So this is what a load curve looks like. This is a daily load curve reflecting the various fluctuations in demand on this system over time. The yellow represents the base load. As you can see, that's a kind of a flat line throughout. That's where you hope to use base load power plants. They operate at constant power output, and you hope that they're going to operate at their maximum capacity throughout the time they're operating. These power plants are characterized by fairly high per kilowatt capital costs, but they also have usually the best operating costs, the fuel costs, kilowatt hour costs. So their operating costs are low. In the blue area, these are the intermediate periods. We have some power plants coming online past the peak. Past the when demand gets past the base load. They operate with slow variation in power output on a regular schedule, and it's expected to follow the variation in demand. Peak load plants are represented by the red. They operate with fast variation, responding to minute peaks in demand above and below the pre-planned part of the supply. They have to come on instantaneously. They have to be ready to go. Typically, they have very low capital costs, but the operating costs tend to be the highest in the system, and you don't want to run them very often because of that. So they are not operating anywhere near their full capacity. They stand idle much of the time. So in our system, here is a graph showing age and capacity of electric generators by fuel type. Hydroelectric plants, which are our cheapest form of energy in most part. Unfortunately, they represent 24 of the 25 oldest power plants. They're greater than 60 years old. Wind is 36% of the capacity addition since 2006. 51% of all generating capacity is at least 30 years old. This should be a little frightening to you. Power plants usually, when they're put into service in the old cost of service rate cases, generally when they're first put in, they get a useful life of somewhere between 30 and 50 years, somewhere in between those. And so a lot of these power plants, at least for regulatory purposes, in the old days are coming to the end of their useful life. 73% of coal plants, which constitute most of our baseload facilities, are older than 30 years as of 2010. Now, on the other hand, most gas plants are less than 10 years old. So here's the capacity, and this is just the amount, the kilovolt rates or kilowatt rates on these power plants. Note that capacity of natural gas has begun to exceed that of coal. Historically, that's not been true. Coal has had very little change in capacity over time. Natural gas has had almost a 61% change since 2001. But look at wind. Wind's still not a big player, but look at the percent of change, over 900% change. Overall, we've added about 22.5% of our capacity since 2001. Now this is electric energy. This means now we're generating kilowatts. Coal's losing ground, and if I were to put up the projections for 2012, they're really losing ground. They're below 40% for the first time in history. Natural gas is still not caught up in terms of total output, and that's because natural gas plants tend to be the peaker units, and we don't run them as often, so they're not generating as many kilowatt hours. But it has picked up 54% increase in output over time. Wind is over 1,300%. Overall, we have produced about 10.4% additional output since from 2001 to 2010. Now, this is an important graphic because we're looking at the levelized cost of power plants. If you're trying to make a determination what kind of power plant you would want to put into the system. First, I want to note anything that says CSS, it should be CCS. That is captured carbon sequestration. I never pronounced that right. It really doesn't exist commercially. We've got plans to have 4 demonstration projects online by 2016. So you want to keep this in mind, but I put them on here as a default for what you might want to look at in terms of the environmental imperatives we're facing. If we do take seriously that climate change is here, that human beings contribute to it, that there's still a possibility of doing something about it, you have to get serious about this industry and its contribution to greenhouse gases. So if you're looking at any kind of power plant up here that I've got CCS, that should have been CCS here with coal, that represents really a serious attempt to do something about it. But we don't know whether captured carbon is going to work. The technology has worked at kind of experimental stages. We don't know if we can scale it up. What I do want to say is that it has some of the same problems nuclear power does. We have to figure out, and we still haven't in this country, what to do about nuclear waste. Well, this is waste. And we're putting it into the ground, and we don't want it to migrate anywhere. We sure don't want it to come up to the surface again. And once it's down there, it's going to be there a long time. So if we're contributing to another storage potential problem, nuclear and coal and maybe natural gas to the extent that we use carbon capture as a technique to deal with our environmental issues. But look at the cost of that. This is why coal is losing, because the people are anticipating that we are going to regulate coal and demand that coal do something about greenhouse gases. And advanced coal is another attempt to do that. These costs are going up. And when you get down to here and look at some of the renewables, they're above wind, significantly above wind. Solar is still lagging, but they're above geothermal and biomass. They're approaching or exceeding biomass. So this is an indication that if we are serious about doing something about this problem and going to renewable energy, we will force carbon-based power plants to do something about their emissions. Their costs are going to go up. Here it is with natural gas. And they're approaching some of the numbers of the renewables. The renewable cost factors, while still high, are falling geometrically each year. We're on a convergence. Nuclear is still very expensive relative to other forms. The least expensive out there right now is conventional combined cycle or advanced cycle natural gas plants. Combined cycle means we run through we use natural gas to turn a turbine. We use the exhaust to run a steam turbine. It's very efficient. All these other power plants, when I said that they're they're a secondary source. Electric power is a secondary source of energy. We use primary energy to create it. In most power plants, two-thirds of the energy value of that primary energy goes up in smoke as we create electric power. But not so these combined cycle plants. They're about two-thirds energy efficient. So there are a lot of reasons maybe to want to use them. And look here, we used to say that natural gas should not be a baseline power plant. But with these kinds of total levelized costs and with operating costs still somewhat higher than coal, but maybe okay, we can run them at a high capacity factor. And what we mean by running a high capacity factor is that we divide the actual output from that power plant by what the output would have been if they ran at its rated capacity 100% of the time. So if we're running these anything that's running in the 80s or higher can be used for base load and intermediate power. Everything else is going to be a peaker unit. These guys aren't peakers. What's going on here is that when we look at renewables, they have two major problems. One is their location constraint. We can build a coal plant anywhere we can get a permit to build it. Wind corridors exist in certain places. Sunlight adequate for the job exists in certain places. Geothermal energy exists, resources exist in certain places, and a lot of those places are remote to any substation and have no transmission connectivity at the present time. So one, renewables have a constraint in that they're location constrained, and we're going to have to do something about connecting them to the grid. We, in Oklahoma, are looking at a project that will take wind from the panhandle of Oklahoma, run it through Oklahoma and Arkansas, and connect up with Tennessee on a very high voltage direct current line. That's an example of trying to overcome the fact that they're location constrained. But the other is they're intermittent. Sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And when that happens, you don't have continuing output, which means it's difficult to deal with if you're trying to manage the grid. Remember, I said the grid has to always be in balance. If this stuff's up and down, up and down, up and down, as these sources become a more important part of the mix, you're going to have significant variations in the power that's going up and down, and you're going to have to provide some kind of quick-acting backstop. This is why T. Boone Pickens proposed a partnership between wind and natural gas. He believed that what we ought to do is pair up wind projects with fast-acting peaker units, these natural gas units, and they're the backup. As wind goes up and down, these natural gas plants go up and down. And it's a good example of why many, including myself, believe that natural gas is the appropriate bridge fuel to the renewable future. Okay, so transmission lines have some efficiencies of scale. So a lot of them operate in this 230 kilovolt area. We start getting these higher kilovolt projects, and they're kind of controversial right now, but you get some significant efficiencies over time. The capital costs are high, but the cost per gigawatt mile, meaning the amount of stuff running through those systems, starts dropping precipitously as you build these higher kilovolt projects. You have line losses as you go through these systems. And generally, losses are decreased by increasing the voltage level to push things through. And you get a geometrically decreasing line losses as you increase your voltage on the line. So if you had a power of 2,000 megawatts going through the line, note the 345 kilovolt transmission line is going over 100 miles, will lose about 166 megawatts. At the 765 kilovolt level, it's only 16. They start off fairly close at the 500 megawatt, but as we run more and more energy through, as you increase the capacity going through, you start getting significant savings by increasing the voltage of the lines. Okay, so this gives you an idea of the physical aspects of our network, and now I'm going to turn to some of the more economic things. So the natural monopoly is characterized by having economies of scale so the market can be most efficiently served by one supplier, or it has an infrastructure too cumbersome to duplicate. How many of you would like to see 3 different power line companies running through your neighborhood in order to have competition? Nobody would. So we can say that the distribution networks and the transmission networks largely, can't say totally, but largely are natural monopoly in their characteristics. But we used to say that about the entire system, generator through all the substations and all the lines. But after a while, people started thinking that maybe we ought to look at those generators the same way back, about the time you were first allowed to buy a phone other than the black thing that AT&T sent out to you. That maybe power plants could be the same thing. They're just bigger and more complex and a hell of a lot more expensive. But there isn't anything necessarily automatically, naturally monopolistic about individual power plants. Nevertheless, the prevailing industry structure forced most power companies to operate in a single state or very close to that. This is in reaction to some grafting and corruption within the power industry from the time of Edison until the New Deal. And electric power companies are vertically integrated. So PSO is an example before all of this. Before we went through our regulatory change, PSO owns and operates generators, transmission systems, and distribution lines, and they pretty much operated in isolation to any other power system. What did they do to get money? They went to the Corporation Commission and asked, well, in some states, in Oklahoma, they didn't have to do that, but you would go in most states to your state public utility commission. You would say, we've got a project, we think we needed more power, so we want to build a new power plant. We need some more transmission, we want to build that. You get a certificate of public convenience and necessity if the commission agrees that this project is worthwhile and beneficial and cost effective. And then you can start building. And once it's completed and put into service, it's called used and useful. It goes into the rate base, and you can start getting money back at a regulated rate that covers the cost of covers all your operating cost and covers a return to your capital cost plus a reasonable rate of return. And that's how you finance these things. What were the rates based on? Well, we based them not on a market price. We set rates basically on an average cost of service rate. We just basically looked at what the operating costs were, looked at what the rate base was, factored in the rate of return. These were the total revenues that you were going to get, and we figured out a way to allocate those revenues to customers. But this is an average cost. This isn't a marginal cost. In the competitive world, we say that people price not at their average costs, which will return over time all your money, but you're always looking at the margin. How much is it going to cost you to produce the next increment of output? It's likely in most cases to be higher than that average cost rate. And through the interaction of supply and demand, we get a marginal cost price for everybody in that field. So we're pricing in the old system below marginal costs. Now, a guy named Harold Dempsett said it wasn't necessary to do regulation this way. What we ought to do is let people bid to connect to the grid. In other words, he was going to separate the out generation and let people who wanted to do generation projects bid to connect to the grid. He thought then the inputs for entry available to many bidders would come in at competitive market prices. The only thing he warned about is that you've got to make sure that the cost of rival collusion is prohibitive. If you want an example of how this failed in a real time, consider the recall election in California in the wake of the disastrous meltdown of their electric grid at the first part of this decade. The rivals figured out ways of manipulating the system about the same time that California was experiencing a drought and as a consequence was losing some of its hydropower. They also had a couple of power plants that had problems, and the thing got manipulated by various competitors, maybe simultaneously deciding, oh, you know, I guess we better shut down for some maintenance. And the consequence was a huge loss of supply relative to a fairly high demand and pricing going through the roof. And they had set up a market pricing system that was so flawed that they couldn't undo this manipulation. And this was set up by a Republican legislature under a Republican governor that Gray Davis inherited, but he was removed from office because of the results of it. Justice Breyer looked at it from an economic point of view. He said the historic costs are being used, not the reproduction or marginal costs. There's a poor estimate of the needed rates of return. You know, that is an exercise, for those of you who have ever looked at it, is an exercise of computer modeling. Garbage in, garbage out. Anytime I've ever witnessed a rate case, they're all over the place, and some lawyer who doesn't know that much about modeling is trying to question people on whether their models are accurate or not. The use of historic data does not estimate changes. We are usually working on a test year. We're not allowed to project the future. We're looking at the cost of the last test year. And demand elasticity is difficult to calculate. When we decide how to make everybody pay their rates in order to give the company the allowed revenues it's supposed to have, if you can't accurately do demand elasticity, you may set somebody's rate too high, and as a consequence, a number of them will leave the system. And when they do, that leaves behind a lot of capital costs that have to be dumped on anybody else. Or you might get it to where it's too high, elasticity is too high, and you give them a low rate, and now they're taking much more than you really want them to take. So if you don't get this right, you have real problems. Pressure for change. There was high inflation and interest rates in the late 60s and 70s that drove up construction of power plants. We had two major energy shocks emanating out of the Middle East in 73 and again in 79. Nuclear power problems, especially TMI. It seems like about every 20 years we had one of these. We had one in Japan, we had one in Chernobyl, we had one at TMI. There was a decline in demand because we were going through a recession. This resulted in substantial rate increases from 1970 to 1985, 25% in real terms for residential users and 86% in real terms for industrial users. Keep in mind this was a real shock because there was a golden age of electric power that ran roughly from about the 1920s into the early 1970s, where in many states there was never a rate increase. They would bring on new power plants. They were more efficient, so were the transmission lines. They could make a return. As a matter of fact, if they had ever done a rate case, the commissions would have ordered a rate decrease because they were making so much money at the old rate, given the way they were lowering their costs. Why would they come in and ask for anything? So when you started experiencing this after 50 years of level rates, people were really outraged. So state regulators began stricter regulation of construction and energy costs, and they disallowed significant investments in purchases. Keep in mind what that looks like. You come in and say, I want to build a power plant. How much is it going to cost? It's going to cost $500 million. Well, yeah, we agree. We'll give you a certificate of convenience and necessity. Now you start constructing the thing, and you're into it about 3 years into the cycle. You've got $200 million down the drain, and the commission decides for the first time in history that it has the legal authority to come back and reverse itself and say, I'm sorry, you can't do it, and maybe we won't let you recover any of the costs. It's turned out that you've blown your estimates. Well, that happened to a lot of people building nuclear power plants, especially in the wake of TMI. Everything got held up. It got held up right at the time that interest rates and inflation started going up. And so the consequence was risk adverseness in the industry. People didn't want to build anything or even try to build anything. Customers cut back use and sought efficiency options. Industrial users self-generated, demanded better rates for low. They would say, I'm going to leave if you don't give me another rate. Or they asked economic development rates. I'll come into your state, but you've got to give us a better rate than everybody else. So the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978 created something called qualified facilities. They were small generators using alternative energy sources and cogeneration plants, and the mandate to all public utility companies was to purchase at their incremental cost if they did not, they would incur if they did not purchase or generate their power from somewhere else. So essentially these guys got a break with a mandate that all the companies, if they located in a company service area, they had to buy for them. Began the appearance of independent power producers. It was prompted by the qualified facilities success, and it was facilitated by new efficient power plant technology such as combined cycle generators and circulating fluid bed combustion boilers. As a consequence, these folks were able to compete even though they didn't have a federal government backing them with a mandate telling the power companies they had to buy from them. So we removed some obstacles. We had obstacles to expanding interstate competition. The PUCA ownership restrictions, vertically integrated utilities refused to provide non-discriminatory transmission services. The need for project financing had to be backed by long-term contracts. I've said already that the power companies were a little gun-shy on this. So there were legislative and regulatory responses to this. We've removed the PUCA limits for exempt wholesale generators. We had various initiatives to overcome transmission discrimination. Open access transmission tariffs, where we were requiring everybody engaged in jurisdictional transmission services, meaning interstate transmission, they had to file tariffs guaranteeing everybody out there, competitors or anybody, that they would provide transmission to them on the same way that they provided transmission for their own facilities. Regional transmission organizations were authorized, and I'll talk about those in a moment. This is a way of pulling together, asking all the public utilities within a particular area to turn over operation of their transmission networks to a single entity that they became a member of. And market-based rates initiatives. Okay, so the open access transmission tariffs, we promoted wholesale. I'm not going to try to go through the details of all these orders. Any one of these orders would take me all day to discuss in terms of details. They're so long and involved. But Order 888 basically demanded that all jurisdictional companies, meaning those people providing providing interstate transmission services, file an open access tariff. At the same time and on the same day, they said they had to go and look at their software and begin to churn out on a website that everybody could see minute by minute data showing everybody who might need transmission services what kind of capacity was available. Well, that was a huge expense, and later we required them to coordinate that if they weren't even a part of an RTO. We demanded that they standardize generating interconnection agreements, and we did this for large generators, small generators, and for wind energy. We did this because companies weren't really wanting to let somebody else connect to their network, particularly if they're going to run energy to somebody they were already serving. This was to overcome discrimination and to give these folks an opportunity to come on board and get connected under terms that were at least as beneficial as people were giving their own generators. The Commission, FERC, in Order 890, established a bunch of rules to deal with what they saw was continuing market manipulation by transmission companies to try to undo this discrimination. The same for standards of conduct and promoting a competitive market for capacity. Capacity meaning both transmission capacity, in this case transmission capacity. Now we're also looking at how we do cost allocation. This is one of the most technical and divisive elements of anything you do with a transmission operation. Remember what I said, that if you put in electric power in one part of the grid, it energizes the whole grid, right? Well, that energizing of the whole grid means that some aspect of the grid everywhere is being used because of what you did. How then do we bill you for the costs that you've imposed on the system? How do we allocate costs to you as the generator, or those transmission costs that you want your customers of your electric power to bear? There's all sorts of theories. I looked at an algorithm the other day that went from here to here in terms of some economist and mathematician trying to figure out ways of dealing with cost allocation. And it's very, very divisive, and it's right now one of the single most important holdups in getting new transmission lines on board, because all the people who are already on the system don't want to have increased costs because somebody new wants to get on. Everybody wants to claim that we won't benefit from it. These are the only people who are going to benefit from it. And if you get all these snags, then you cannot get an agreement that will work. People will go to court, fight you forever until the whole project isn't worth doing. We now have one of the most recent orders deals with the integration of variable energy sources. That's wind, that's solar, and it's taking account that their intermittency is producing problems for the grid, so we're demanding that these folks provide an extraordinarily amount of data about how their systems operate, particularly under changing weather conditions, to the grid operators. But in turn, we now are requiring scheduling on a 5-minute interval. It was on an hour interval. 15-minute interval. No, I'm right, it was 5 minutes. It's millions of dollars of now computerized work that all the transmission companies and dispatchers have to go through to redo their programs for dispatching in order to accommodate these power plants. So the OTA did not work as hoped. The grids experienced engineering and economic inefficiencies. Discrimination was still too prevalent, and so in Order 2000, the FERC strongly encouraged the utilities to join together in a regional transmission organization or an independent system operation. And they identified 4 minimum characteristics of an effective RTO. I'm going to use that in short for all of these. They identified 8 minimum functions for approved RTOs that approved RTOs must perform, and they established RTO rate-making policies. So ultimately, this is what's happened. These colored areas are the service territories of a regional transmission organization. The ones over here are the ones that are operating in the United States. We have the California ISO. We have the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. We have the Southwest Power Pool. We are in that one. We have the Midwest ISO right in here. We've got this huge sprawling thing called PGM interconnection. New York has its own ISO, and then New England has an ISO. Canada's also running their versions of this. So the minimum characteristics are they have to be independent. Limits on ownership and standards for independent decision-making were imposed to insulate RTOs from control by any market participant. The RTO had to have sufficient size and regional coverage to meet regulatory, reliability, operational, and competitive objectives. It had to have authority to control all key transmission functions. That means these members have to turn it all over to the OTO. They have to provide, they have the exclusive authority over interchange scheduling, redispatching for reliability and transmission maintenance approval. And their functions include tariff administration and design. If you're in an RTO, and you may have been a jurisdictional company, but you don't have to file your own tariff now. You're a part of an RTO. The RTO files the tariff that covers everybody that's a member of the RTO. They have to deal with congested management, so they were to establish congestion markets built on locational marginal pricing and financial transmission rights. This means that at a point where there is congestion, some efficient power plant was trying to send energy to here, but it's blocked. You're going to have to meet somebody's needs by scheduling a more inefficient power plant behind the node to meet those needs. That means that now there is a gap in what the energy prices would have been if you could have gotten through to what they're going to be on redispatch, and you charge that price, that higher price. And financial transmission rights are a way of hedging against being charged this sort of thing. It's yet another kind of Wall Street instrument. And you would think that you would only allow people within the industry to buy and sell these things, but if you want to gamble, you can go to buy them and sell them too. And literally that's what it is, because keep in mind what I said about the electromagnetic unity of the grid. Nobody knows where the energy goes. There is congestion here sometimes. It can come over here. It can come up in a lot of different places that are unanticipated. So that's why you need hedges. You have to address parallel flow problems. So remember I said you could have 2 or 3 different paths from one point to the other. And it will take all forks in the road. So power is flowing in all these ways. But what's the contract path? It's not the physical path. The contract path is point A to point B. The physical path's all over the place. But these folks are collecting the revenue for all of the stuff coming out of that contract, but they're imposing costs on everywhere that energy goes. And some of those folks may or may not recover the cost depending on how cost allocation turns out. So they're asked to address those issues. Ancillary services, I never really knew about them until recently, and you wouldn't have either until we broke up the old integrated system. But it turns out that this balancing act that we've got to do, the company was just doing that as a part of their regular operations when it was all a vertically integrated thing. You didn't worry about that, but now you too can pay an extra price for ancillary services. Since we've created markets for about 6 or 7 different ones, including providing reactive dynamic energy, which means you have a power plant operating at a different rate that creates energy that's not useful for consumers but helps maintain the efficiency of the transmission lines, and without it, the transmission network would quickly be in trouble. While those power plants are doing that, they can't sell energy to anybody, so they have to be compensated for that special operation. And we've got a dynamic market for that, which adds to costs. The RTOs are to maintain that website telling the whole world what's available on their system minute by minute. They're responsible for market monitoring to make sure that the markets that they're operating aren't being manipulated at any particular time. They're responsible for getting everybody together who are members of the RTO to do planning and encouraging expansion of the transmission grid. And they were responsible for interregional coordination. Remember I talked about we've got those 7 or 8 different RTOs. So this is a demand by FERC that they explore also interconnecting among the RTOs, doing, coordinated service. The rate making The mandates eliminate pancake rates. Imagine if you had to pay an extra transmission charge every time some current that you were going to receive went through somebody else's transmission line. That's what pancaking is. Every transmission system adds to their thing. So what they're trying to do in an RTO is undo all of that, do some kind of rational cost allocation approach, and then you either get a postage stamp or a license plate kind of rate. A postage stamp is like here in America, you pay your 40-some cents or wherever it is now, wherever you are, and the letter can go anywhere. So that's what a postage stamp rate would be. Anywhere you are in the system, wherever it's going, you pay that rate. License plate means that there is something really unique about this one location that makes it more expensive than the other. So if you were to do a survey of what license plates charges are all across the country, there would be dramatic differences. Same here. So maybe if you're in this one location, you'll pay a particular rate, and somebody over here will pay a lower or higher rate, but everybody in that area pays that same license plate rate. Encourage the use of this locational marginal pricing and FTRs to manage congestion. It authorized RTOs and its members to discriminate against a transmission customer who is non-participating. That means somebody within the middle of your area of an RTO just won't join up, but they want to use your network. So they're saying you don't have to give them the same access as everybody else unless they sign up. It encourages the use of performance-based rates tied to benchmarks. If you hit output and efficiency and reliability standards, will give you a higher rate than if you didn't meet those benchmarks. So recently we've had some improvement mandates. Long-term transmission rights in organized markets under Order 681 was trying to make it easier for people to lock in transmission rights to back their long-term supply and contracts, their production and supply contracts. Order 719 dealt with more issues about how to prevent discrimination and market manipulation. Demand response compensation. What if you're trying to balance? You can balance two ways as you fluctuate, but let's say it's fluctuating on the higher scale, that more people are demanding electricity than what you previously scheduled. How could you meet it? Well, you could bring more production online, or you could do something over here on the demand side and get people to take less. The FERC determined that there ought to be equality of being able to bid to do the balancing, that these folks willing to reduce their energy take in a time when you needed to balance because too much demand was meeting too little supply, they ought to get the same rates and the same breaks as people willing to produce something. I call this the negawatt approach. And I borrowed that from Amory Levins, who's my hero. I read everything he did. He coined the term negawatts because most of the time it costs less to save the production of a kilowatt than it is to produce one. And if we were all to have a negawatt mentality, I think we would have a lot more efficient system, and it would be a lot more environmentally sound. Frequency regulation, compensation, you got to keep this megahertz thing going. If they get out of cycle, you've got a problem. You've got various kinds of power plants that may decide that they won't produce energy. They'll do what's necessary to inject into the system the kind of thing necessary to keep the cycle so we can stay coordinated. This is treating them in a way where they can make money on an equivalent basis with those who are producing power for those of us to consume. We're also preventing anti-competitive market behaviors. I won't go through all of these, but they're all designed in various ways to make sure that anybody that has real market power can't get market rates, or if they're manipulating the system, we can catch it and do it and remedy the problem. So here's my questions for the future. Will the competitive market structure provide adequate incentives for constructing appropriate replacement and new power plant rates and transmission lines? I don't think it's any accident that natural gas and wind are the only things being built right now. They may not be the most appropriate baseline plants, and remember I've said our baseline plants are getting older and older. But remember, they can't go to a commission, get something in the rate base, and be guaranteed a rate of return. They have to do project financing, and they have to depend on the vagaries of this up and down market in order to finance the thing, to get the revenues, to get somebody to want them to loan the money or invest in the project. And I just don't see right now that the system is working in a way that's keeping up. Will the U.S. step up to blunt climate change? I want to talk about water. I teach water law. It turns out that the industry, the single largest use of water in the United States is the electric power industry. And when you think about it, what are they doing? Whoop. Thought that was going to be off. That's a warning. I have 5 minutes by. So thermal energy plants essentially heat water to turn turbines, right? But nuclear plants have a special need for water. If anything goes wrong, you need to dump it all over the core. In Europe, about a year and a half ago, because of drought conditions attributable to many people think to climate change, water table levels got so low in many of the service areas of nuclear power plants, they had to shut them down because they no longer had the water supply necessary to operate safely in case anything happened. If you're dependent on hydroelectric and water is going down due to drought conditions, you've got a problem too. We need to phase out coal, period. There's no such, I'm going to say, there's no such thing as clean coal. When you hear our two presidential candidates talking about it, they're both lying. There is no such thing as clean coal. It's always going to produce a lot of emissions, but forget emissions for a moment. When you're leveling entire mountaintops and dumping the residue into river systems in West Virginia so that that water is lost forever, that's not clean either. If you ever go out and look at a stack of coal sitting out there, one time I went out and saw one, it was smoking. They had some kind of spontaneous combustion coming in the pile. It wasn't lined, so stuff was running off and it was going into the river system next to it. So there's no such thing as clean coal, but climate change certainly means we got to do something. My point of view, and this is where I think Oklahomans ought to be, natural gas is the bridge. We've got much more natural gas operations and companies involved in that than we do in coal mining. For the life of me, I can't see why our representatives love coal if they're going to do a good job for you and me and the climate. It requires a continued commitment to renewable subsidization and or aggressive internalization of environmental costs. It can be either or. I would love to have a carbon tax. The word tax is verboten in this country. Nobody can articulate it and get elected dog catcher anymore, particularly in this state. But a carbon tax would be efficient. You wouldn't have to, in Governor Romney's terms, say, make the federal government pick winners. If you had an appropriate tax that internalized the environmental costs of a power plant, its costs would rise as some of these renewables are going down. You wouldn't be picking a winner. You would make them internalize all the costs they're imposing on the entire world from their operations. If you're not going to do that, then you have to subsidize renewables. You can't both resist any effort to internalize the carbon emission problem on traditional power plants and at the same time say, but don't give these other technologies the money needed to progress. Will smart grid technology be accepted and deployed? Smart grid, ultimately, to me, is Big Brother coming to your home. I'm a smart grid skeptic. I'm not a Luddite. I like technology, usually. But this is where they're going to meter up your home and get signals from every appliance in your home as to what you're doing every time of day, ostensibly to give you the greater benefit of being able, if you can do something better than you do when you set your TV thing to record, you can do settings to maybe set so you're turning stuff on and on and off to meet the cost curves of the power plant and maybe achieve some savings. But I grew up reading 1984. I remember watching the big screen, watching us, and Skype scares me to death every time I'm on it. And it's not too long before we're doing this for your benefit, to where you have to keep it on all the time so we can see exactly what you're doing in terms of your appliances. You can get a lot of read on people's lifestyles if you know exactly what appliances are on in the day and night. I think there are economic benefits from doing this. There may be some environmental benefits from doing this. I'm questioning whether it's going to be politically acceptable as people see what kind of intrusion it makes in their lives. So that may be the problem. Will game-changing technology emerge? This, to me, is the big question. If we're needing to replace somewhere around 51% of our power plants, and if we do a power plant as we know it, it's got a 30 to 50-year life cycle. Do we really want to make these commitments when there are maybe some emerging technologies that will obviate the need to ever do those things? And I've got three that I think are the game changers. If you get cost-effective photovoltaic solar technology backed by advances in electric power storage technology, you can be off the grid. The other one, and to me the gold standard, is a cost-effective workable hydrogen fuel cell. They're not out there right now. Back when I first started doing energy policy, if we kept the incentives that we said we were going to do, it might have been here by 2015. It's not. It's going to be a ways. But here's what I worry about. The United States doesn't seem to want to back these things anymore. We're having a food fight over it now in the presidential race. But China is force-feeding it. India is force-feeding it. You've got countries like Denmark that have no natural resources other than some wind, a little bit of oil here and there, but they're way advanced on advanced batteries. I think the United States has only one advanced battery technology company worthy of the name out there researching this stuff. Fuel cells, we've got a guy in California that got some 60-minute time, and Google bought some of his fuel cells, but other countries are doing better on this. So what happens if we make all these investments in what we've always been investing in, and one of these other countries gets these breakthroughs? To me, this is the OPEC of the future right here.